You don't get to sneak, you don't get to hide, you don't get to have secrets. Not in my house.
Do you see how loving that is?
I don't love this. Hi, my name is Sydney, welcome back to hell. And as per usual, before we launch in, today's video is sponsored by me and my new little tea company, Lions Tea Exchange, which you should go and check out if you haven't already. I've created a bunch of artisan tea blends that use, of course, real tea leaves and these giant pyramid tea bags. The feedback so far has been so positive and so lovely, and I worked really hard on making something super high quality that tastes absolutely incredible. Also, considering the fact that this video is 100% getting demonetized, if you want to support me and the channel, buying a box of my tea is definitely a way to do it, and I hand pack all of your orders and ship them with love. It also tastes really good, and I put a lot of effort into it, and it's not weird and drop shipped, I promise. Now, there was once a period of time where family channels here on YouTube were all the rage. And many of these accounts grew very large followings for reasons I can't really understand. I guess I'm not really the target demographic. But as time has gone on, a bunch of the people behind these channels have either been called out by their audiences for abusing or harming their children, or have literally been investigated and sometimes arrested by police for their parenting. And the focus of today's video, Ruby Frankie, is no exception. Now, if you've been following the news at all recently, you will have probably come into contact with this name. And if you haven't, lucky you for the next few minutes, because I'm about to tell you all about it. Ruby Frankie started a family channel back in 2015 and went on to gain a lot of attention over the years, mostly for negative reasons though. But in late 2023, she and her business partner, Jody Hilderbrand, were arrested and charged with child abuse. In February 2024, the pair were also found guilty of said child abuse, and both women were sentenced to up to 30 years in prison. Things got even more intense very recently when police released a bunch of information related to the case. Audio recordings, videos, images, most of which, I'm not gonna lie, are very brutal, and I obviously won't be including them in this video for obvious reasons, but if you are interested, they're not that hard to find. To date, Ruby has been the primary focus for most people, and I completely understand why. After all, it was her children who were the subjects of the abuse in this situation, in this case, and she is, I guess, a big infamous player in all of this. But in my travels of the internet, I happened upon a video of a young woman called Jody Hilderbrand, who happens to be the niece of Jody Hilderbrand. Jessie lived with Jody as a teenager and was exposed to a tremendous amount of abuse under her roof. In this particular interview, Jessie said that while Ruby was absolutely at fault, she believed that Jody was actually the ringleader behind the horrible events that happened.
But it's interesting to watch the world respond to her and kind of putting her as at the forefront. And I understand that she's the mother of these children, and it makes sense. But the philosophies and the therapeutic modalities that she's using are Jody's. So yeah, it's been a really interesting experience watching everyone focus on Ruby, and I understand why. But this is Jody. These are Jody's words. These are Jody's ideas. These are over decades old.
I won't lie, this comment definitely got my wheels turning, and I decided that I wanted to look into it a little bit further, given that I hadn't really seen anybody addressing this issue besides Jessie from this perspective. And just to be clear here, so there's absolutely no confusion, Ruby Frankie is absolutely 100% responsible for what happened to her children. I'm not trying to downplay that. I'm not trying to say that she's somehow innocent in all of this. She's clearly not. But sometimes two people meet who probably should never meet, and it's just a recipe for disaster. Kind of how a lot of us feel about our exes. But the more I looked into Jody Hilderbrand and what she's all about, and she's a counselor, mind you, and that's her whole claim to fame in all of this, I realized that Jessie Hilderbrand's assertions are probably correct. So that's what we're going to talk about today, the absolutely depraved individual behind Ruby Frankie's House of Horrors. And obviously Ruby Frankie herself, who is also a rotten person. Of course, all of my regular disclaimers, this video is by no means exhaustive, and there is a treasure trove of information that you can go and look at in your own time if you want more information about certain components that are associated with this case. And the other thing I want to note is that because we're talking about pretty not okay situations relating to children. I am not going into detail with this. I'm not going to show you any pictures. I don't want to be graphic, and obviously this is for educational purposes and yada yada yada. YouTube, please don't punish me. You get the idea. In late August 2023, a 12-year-old boy climbed out of the window of a home in Ivins, Utah. Wearing a long, ratty shirt, shorts, and shoes, the child appeared at an elderly neighbor's front door and quietly asked if the man could take him to the nearest police station. The man was stunned and confused. The boy had duct tape on his wrists and ankles, wounds on his body, and was clearly malnourished. Seeing his terrible condition, the man instructed the 12-year-old to sit down before he quickly phoned law enforcement. During the 911 call, the man clearly tells the dispatcher that the child had escaped from somewhere, his voice breaking as he describes the boy's situation.
I just had a 12-year-old boy show up here at my front door asking for help. And he's said he just came from a neighbor's house, and we know there's been problems at this neighbor's house. He's emaciated, he's got tape around his legs, he's hungry, and he's thirsty. Okay, this boy has been... This kid has obviously been... I think he's been detained. He's obviously covered in wounds.
Okay. Let's get the paramedics headed over that way, okay?
Before long, law enforcement were on the scene and learned that things were much worse than they'd originally anticipated. The young boy turned out to be the child of once popular mummy vlogger Ruby Frankie. He, along with his mum and 9-year-old sister, had been visiting the home of Ruby's business partner, Jody Hilderbrand. Police made their way into Jody's home, eventually pushing past her and into the house while she angrily protested outside.
You can't just come into my house without a search warrant.
We'll explain everything after this, ma'am.
Listen, I don't want to come across badly here, but I don't know what it is about this clip that makes me just want to maim this woman. Like, you have the goal to tell police officers not to come into your home without a search warrant when only a couple meters away there's a tiny person suffering with her head shaved. Like, I just... Ugh. After 7 minutes searching inside, they found the 9-year-old girl cowering away from them, hidden in a closet that appears to double up as a safe. The child sat mute and terrified, even when specialist officers arrived to help coax her out of the home. Soon, Ruby herself arrived at the residence, and she and Jody were arrested and taken into custody. This singular event kicked off a harrowing, disturbing investigation into Ruby Frankie and the worldview, the belief system that led to the abuse of all of her children. But as much as people like to say and act like Ruby Frankie acted alone, I think the truth of the matter here is that she was acting under the guidance and maybe even supervision of her business partner Jody Hilderbrand, a very evil woman who enacted her twisted worldview onto her patients and those around her, but especially onto children. Ruby Frankie started her YouTube channel 8 Passengers in 2015 along with her husband Kevin. The account's content was pretty normal at first. Ruby detailed her life as a suburban mother of 6 children and their experiences living in Utah. Yes, they're Mormons. They're all Mormons. Let's establish that from the outset. At its height, the channel had over 2 million subscribers and millions of monthly views. But over time, people began to notice the cruel and unusual ways Ruby dealt with her children. In one 2020 video, one of Ruby's sons said that his mother had taken his room from him as a punishment for pranking his younger brother. The young man admits that he slept on a beanbag for 7 months, while Ruby laughs to herself about the situation.
Do you think it's funny? Because...
And then I walk out.
If you think it's funny, then that was 7 months ago. Maybe you need longer without a bedroom.
In another, Ruby said that she refused to bring her then 6-year-old daughter food at school because the little girl had forgotten to pack her own lunch that day.
This happens quite often when you're raising children, because I know that her teacher is uncomfortable with her being hungry and not having a lunch. And it would ease her discomfort if I came to the school with a lunch. But I responded and just said, is responsible for making her lunches in the morning, and she actually told me she did pack a lunch. So the natural outcome is she's just going to need to be hungry. And hopefully Hopefully nobody gives her food and nobody steps in and gives her a lunch.
Other videos showed the children sleeping on bathroom floors, Ruby laughing about rarely getting her children Christmas presents, threatening to behead the kids' toys, and frequently withholding food to achieve her ends.
You don't need food. Stop crying or I'm gonna have you go upstairs and you won't have any breakfast. And my kids are literally starving. I hesitate to say this because it's gonna sound like I'm like a mean barbarian. I told the kids, I said, I'm not even gonna let you eat breakfast.
You're gonna lose the privilege to eat dinner.
Soon, more and more viewers were cottoning on to just how alarming Ruby's behavior was getting, with some even describing it as sadistic and cruel. Yeah, depriving your kids of food until they do what you want? Not awesome. In May 2020, a Change.org petition was even launched to have Ruby reported to and investigated by CPS. Funnily enough, before her arrest, Ruby's neighbors had actually gone ahead and made complaints about the welfare of her children to the Utah Division of Child and Family Services. But what doesn't seem to be widely known is that in the summer of 2020, Ruby's home was visited by child welfare officers. During an interview in 2021, Ruby said, "I remember that morning very well. These officers, they were two ladies, said there had been several complaints about child abuse and child neglect. Could they come in and spend some time?" The officers reportedly stayed for a few hours watching Ruby and inspecting her home. They interviewed each of the Frankie children separately as well. Ruby claims that when they were finished, the two women asked her for parenting tips, which I very much frickin' doubt. Luckily for Ruby, no charges were filed, but this entire incident left her feeling deeply unimpressed. And this absolutely was not the first time that the content she was posting on the internet had gotten her into trouble. In the not too distant past, in the spring of 2020, several major advertisers had pulled their support from the 8 Passengers YouTube channel, fearing blowback from the rising negative attention the Frankie parents were getting. Before that, in August 2019, viewers of the channel went mad when they found out that the then 14-year-old Chad, the Frankie's second oldest child, had been expelled from school and they'd sent him to spend 10 weeks at the Anasazi Foundation Wilderness Therapy Program.
And it's reached a point where Chad needs to develop some very basic maturity and skills.
Yeah, coming from the two people who abuse their small children, sure, we're definitely going to be taking maturity advice from you.
This conversation, I think it would be a great place to end the vlog today. We just told Chad that there's a hashtag on Instagram going around that started when you came to Anasazi, and it's hashtag free Chad.
These people are like walking aneurysms, I swear to God. I really do not like this woman. For those of you who are not super familiar with these type of camps, they exist to help young people basically cultivate personal skills and survival skills out in the wilderness, which is supposed to, I don't know, like make them better at being in society. There has been a ton of controversy surrounding them, not just the modern ones, but also ones from way back when. And more young people and teenagers are coming forward to report the abuse and horrible circumstances that they found themselves in when their parents or caregiver sent them to these camps and wilderness retreats and whatnot. So again, can't get into it in this video, but definitely something to look into if this type of thing is of interest to you. And just to be clear, shortly after Chad had returned from the wilderness camp, which may or may not have been abusive, we don't know, he pranked his younger brother and had his room taken away for 7 months. Again, people were incensed. During the same 2021 interview with The Wrap, Ruby insisted that the offending clips, the ones that had gotten viewers so upset, were taken out of context. She said, "The reason we got cancelled was because I was demonstrating, as I have done from day one, what a responsible mother looks like. And it scared the living bejesus out of these kids who do not want to be held accountable," because apparently she thinks that it's children who are mad at her. So that is the motive for the hate being thrown at me. I'm the antidote to their acting out, and they know it. Yeah, Ruby, probably not. I changed my own mind. Ruby isn't a walking aneurysm, she's a full-on lobotomy. Absolutely no one wants to be ice-picked by you, mummy. Ruby Frankie has always seemed to view herself as this ideal mother figure. And in fact, it's one of the reasons why she created her YouTube channel in the first place. For whatever reason, maybe by virtue of the fact that she has 9,000 kids, she viewed herself as a mother who could teach and nurture other mothers. And it's likely what drove a lot of her actions from this point forward and helped her cultivate some of these very unfortunate friendships, one in particular, that, in my opinion, led to the acceleration of abuse. But be patient, we will get to that. 2019 through 2021 were the years of terrible press for the family and their channel. Clips of the family were circulating on TikTok, YouTubers were criticizing them at every turn, and news outlets were reporting all of this. In some ways, I guess it boosted their notoriety. At one point, the channel was getting 200,000 views a day and raking in a decent amount in both sponsorship and AdSense revenue. But with the mounting hatred for Ruby growing on the daily, this didn't last, and soon the channel was dipping. Ruby too pulled back on her regular posting, telling the Wrap that she's more aware of what she puts online and how she articulates herself. Although with this said, she still clung to the idea that every piece of criticism thrown her way was the result of cancel culture and out-of-context clips. I think it was here that something fundamentally changed for her. Ruby seems to have realized that people were going to continue to call out her parenting methods, and her haters were only going to keep growing in number. And this realization seems to have paved the way, led her down the path to the events of 2022, which more or less signaled the beginning of the end for not only Ruby Frankie's life, but the destruction of her family's. Enter Connections and Jody Hilderbrand. Now, from what I've described, it's pretty clear that Ruby Franke and Kevin Frankie were abusive on their own. But I am of the belief that Jody Hilderbrand and her teachings were partially responsible for Ruby's accelerated decline and the levels of child abuse that we saw between 2022 to 2023. Now, by late January 2022, Ruby had completely abandoned the 8 Passengers YouTube channel. Videos had become less and less frequent as it was, but they stopped appearing altogether and being uploaded altogether around this time. No real reason was ever given for this, except for a brief video Ruby posted in mid-December 2021, where she said that she wasn't posting as much because she was getting involved in the mental health community. In this video, she mentioned working with a woman called Jody Hilderbrand and her online counseling company called Connections. While it's not super clear when she arrived on the scene, Jody Hilderbrand has been doing something akin to abusive therapy, as I'm going to name it, for at least 15 years. In 2010, she started Connections, a quote-unquote counseling service for individuals and married couples with a curriculum designed to help treat those lost and stranded in the darkness of distortion, which addictions, fear, sadness, and all other self-destructive behaviors derive from. If you think this sounds like cult speak, that's because it is. These people just say so much to say absolutely nothing at all, and I'm very sorry to admit that there's gonna be a little bit of this going forward. Please try not to cry. But at the core of it, Connections was supposedly there to help individuals take responsibility for their thoughts, feelings, and actions in a way that would help their relationship succeed. Jody claimed that her coaching was a unique style of educating about the power of choice and the need for impeccable honesty, rigorous responsibility, and vulnerable humility. What does this mean? She specifically placed a lot of emphasis on distortion and truth, as she calls it. She believes people need to be rid of their distortion, which leads to all negative things in their lives. Truth, by contrast, is the objective reality that is not based in feelings.
In order for you to see truth, you're going to need to know the opposition. Anytime you go into battle, you need to know the enemy. And distortion is the enemy of truth. We're living in a world right now that largely believes truth is this subjective, ethereal idea, like, what's true for me, and you can have what your truth and my truth, and it's all different.
Very subjective, very based on how I feel.
Yeah, it moves, it's fluid, it changes. There's very a lack of base.
Go kick a rock and see how fluid that is.
I know, that's fluid. Well, it didn't hurt me. I don't know why it hurt you.
If you're feeling lost at this moment, don't worry. I have watched maybe 25, 30 of these videos, and I have absolutely no idea what the hell is going on. I did try to tell you, it's just, Lobotomies everywhere. Trying to make sense of the main thrusts of her ideas, it seems that Jody Hilderbrand believes that you have to own 100% of what happens to you in your life. And if bad things are happening to you, they are entirely your fault. No, this is not a joke. There is no excuse or reason behind them. They are 100% your responsibility, and you need to accept them. Anything less is distortion. This is indicated in plenty of videos, but it's also right there on her website, which reads, "You can have the life you want, but you must dispose of distortion's ugly lies in order to live in truth, connection, and freedom." Whatever that means.
We do not fully understand what causes Alzheimer's disease.
Jody also applies this same logic to children, whom she doesn't seem to believe are any different in their behavior and emotions to adults. Which is crazy. Now, on the surface, these views, although confusing to understand and listen to, might not seem that bad. But if that is your assertion here, I think you're kinda wrong. Given that for Jody Hilderbrand, they underpin the catastrophic abuse that she has subjected so many people to for the better part of 15 years. And kinda horrifyingly, Jody's life philosophies had her crossing people and hurting children long before she ever met Ruby Frankie. Sadder still is the fact that one of the most outspoken of her critics is her own niece, Jody Hilderbrand. Jessie lived with her aunt for a period of time when she was a teenager. In many interviews and podcasts, she describes the abuse she endured during this time, both psychological and physical abuse. In an interview with 2 News, Jessie describes being forced into isolation, not being allowed to interact with other people, duct taped, tied up, having her mouth duct taped shut, and being forced to sleep outside in the snow, among other things.
The things that I experienced while living with Jody, I experienced being tied, I experienced being duct taped, I experienced being blindfolded, I experienced severe isolation, I experienced severe emotional, spiritual, and psychological abuse. The being told I shouldn't be around other people, being told that I was dangerous to be around. People were afraid of me to the point where I was afraid of myself. I was forced to sleep outside in the snow. I was, like I said, isolated for up to 12 hours a day. If someone spoke to me directly, if I wasn't wearing duct tape on my mouth, I had to just stare at them and not respond, because she also had systems of people that would report back to her if I broke any of these rules.
Jessie also details bizarre attitudes Jody had towards sex, not allowing her niece to use tampons, and constantly accusing her of self-pleasuring and having an addiction to online adult content that Jessie says she'd never even seen at the time.
She also, and this is like a very deep connection and why I chose to come forward to the media rather than just staying with the podcast. She accused me of being a sex addict. She accused me of being addicted to the point where I wasn't allowed to, I mentioned this on the podcast, to the point where I wasn't allowed to use tampons. I never was allowed privacy unless I was isolated. So that included the bathroom. I was never allowed to have the door closed because she was convinced that I was just constantly mad. She was convinced that I was addicted to porn. I had never seen porn at that point in my life. I didn't even know that people with my anatomy could masturbate.
And yep, you guessed it, much of what Jessie describes here was experienced not only by the Frankie children, but other very unfortunate victims of Jody Hilderbrand. Police officers describe the Frankie children's living condition as a work camp-like setting. According to the Washington County case summary, the 2 youngest children were regularly denied food, water, beds, and all forms of entertainment. They were not allowed to interact with others and were hidden in the home when others came to visit. They were forced to do physical tasks like carrying loaded boxes up and down stairs and doing ski sits for hours at a time. I'm told people in North America call these wall sits, like when you sit against the wall without a chair. Like this, you see? This is uncomfortable. They were forced to do manual labor outside in the extreme summer heat without shoes, socks, or water. And I want to remind you that we're talking about Utah here. Sometimes they were also forced to stand outside on the hot cement patio for hours and sometimes days. This all in addition to further physical and emotional abuse, which the children came to believe they deserved. Trying to explain Jody's cruel and unusual punishments, Jessie said that Jody would torture her as a teenager in order to, quote, force the sin out, believing to a degree that children are vessels for evil and the devil.
So her rationale to the severity of these punishments and this physical and emotional abuse was she wanted to make my life, and this is like her quote, like this is what she would tell me all of the time. She wanted to make my life so uncomfortable that it would force the sin out, that it would force me to confess. So things continuously got worse and worse and progressively more and more intense as a way to get me to confess, because she believed that if I had confessed everything, if all of my sins were out and in the open, that I would be getting better. And so to hear Ruby tell the world that her child is a sex addict, a predator, and has been addicted to since he was 3 years old, it just echoes exactly the things that she was telling me and telling everyone around me. And I know that I think I don't know if I got this right, but I'm pretty sure that she's saying that he even confessed to it. Well, I also confessed to things that I didn't do as a way of trying to get the abuse to stop.
Jody more or less articulated this herself in redacted recordings provided by the police. In one, she says that the devil uses children and uses adults who don't hold children accountable.
It's all the devil. I mean, you've seen him. I mean, I've known you, for 5 years? You've watched him come at me, come at me, come at me, come at me. Mm-hmm. And you're exactly right, because he knows I know what he's doing. And he uses these kids. And he uses all of us as the adults, the parents that don't hold the kids accountable. So now it's abusive to make a kid sleep on the floor. It's abusive. Or it's abusive to, that's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. You can't even raise your kids anymore.
This sentiment was similarly reflected by Ruby in Jailhouse Recordings, where she refers to her own children as evil.
Adults have a really hard time understanding that children can be full of evil and what that takes to fight it. You've seen what it takes to fight evil. It's not the person you're fighting. And it can look like something it's not. And you've been there, you know that. And so I don't know any adults who are going to see the truth.
As far as Jody's philosophy of forcing the sin out goes, this is precisely what Ruby and Jody were trying to achieve with the two Frankie children. In the Washington County case summary, investigators noted exactly this, writing, "The women appeared to fully believe that the abuse they inflicted was necessary to teach the children how to properly repent for imagined sins and to cast the evil spirits out of their bodies." Ah, man. There are videos where the first responders, the EMTs or the ambulance personnel, are working on both children, trying to help them and whatnot, and they're getting teary-eyed and whatnot while they're dealing with these two little people, and I just completely get it. It's brutal. I am the levity because it's all getting too depressing. Oh, of course you leave me. Thank you for being the levity for a brief time before we delve back into the depths of sadness. This is very bleakly all demonstrated in Ruby's journals from 2023. In the journals, which are very, very heavily redacted, the children are referred to as R, denoting the son, and E, the daughter. They almost give a daily play-by-play of all the violence and torture exercised on the children. Some notable examples are Ruby writing that R was forced to stay and sleep outside unless coming in to use the bathroom or to shower. She writes extensively about how she would punish her daughter by shaving her head when she refused to do manual labor or expressed her emotions, because God forbid you express your emotions. Ruby wrote of her son's upcoming 12th birthday, saying the child made satanic choices. In the next entry, she refers to her children as deviants with sinful behavior, saying she told her son that he emulates a snake that slithers and sneaks. The child responded by telling her that he would rather have a glass of water than Ruby as his mother. Ruby writes further still about forcing her son to stand out in the sun, and when he refused, she used a cactus poker on his neck and body. Although I don't really know what a cactus poker is, but I'm going to assume this is very, very unpleasant. In further entries, she details withholding food from her children, how R steals water from the garden hose, and describes how the kids are entangled with the devil. And disgustingly, all of this mirrors Jesse's experience, down to the very specific views Jody Hilderbrand held and expressed with relation to children being manipulative, evil, and shameful. In recorded calls from their jail cells, both women actually go the extra mile and downplay what happened to the children. In one recording, Jody said that the 12-year-old caused the wounds on his body himself. In another, Ruby says to her husband that her son spending multiple days in the hospital was unnecessary.
Seems like, the pictures are going to destroy you. And I'm like, we didn't do that. We didn't do that. Those pictures we did not do. He did that to himself, yes. Did we put that on him and then he rubbed around and cut himself? Yes. But we didn't do that.
They're going to be in the hospital for 3 days.
So weird. It's just not necessary. Like trying to exaggerate this.
Just to be clear, and like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I obviously can't show you these images, but let me tell you now, these 100% required being in the hospital. I just don't know how a mother or just how a caregiver in general could look at the injuries on these kids and be like, nah, this is fine. This requires no additional attention at all. These people are insane. Disturbingly, much of what Ruby was doing to her children echoed the teaching she had been parroting on Jody's behalf through Connections. While Connections is not overtly religious in its public messaging, not directly mentioning God or the devil, it has obvious parallels in its discussions about truth and distortion. Distortion must be exorcised from a person like a demonic entity. It is the cause of all bad fortunes and prevents you from living in truth. And distortion is effectively owning absolutely everything bad that happens to you, such as, for example, abuse. When Jody was punishing the children, she was using this philosophy. And see, Jody taught that all experiences are neutral, meaning that nothing is inherently good or bad, and you make conscious choices to perceive whatever happens to you as good or bad. This includes even traumatic and painful situations. That Ruby's children were experiencing fear, hunger, exhaustion, and pain was simply them, quote, living in distortion and choosing to project a negative emotion on their situation. I am not making this up. This is what these women actually think. Which was, just by the way, entirely the children's fault according to Jody Hilderbrand's ideology. And that probably sounds insane to a lot of you. And that's because it is. But in true cult-like fashion, I think one of the ways that Jody Hilderbrand was able to get her little hooks, her little tendrils, her little tentacles wrapped around people was by convincing them that they were truly awful humans. And honestly, she did that a lot. While researching Jody and her general belief system and her counseling, I came into contact a lot with evidence that suggested that Jody is convincing, or was convincing, mostly her male patients that they have an addiction to adult entertainment. The word I can't say here on YouTube begins with P. Once again, depressingly, horrifyingly, this is the same thing that was experienced by Jesse Hilderbrand. The first incident that we know about occurred in 2012 when Jody Hilderbrand was put on probation for 18 months and her license as a clinical mental health counselor was in jeopardy. During this time, she reportedly blackmailed a patient, known only as John Doe, who had been seeing her for several years for marriage counseling. Rather than providing any meaningful help in his marriage, John Doe was instead told by Jody that he had a porn addiction, which he obviously denied. When John Doe rightfully expressed displeasure and anger with Hilderbrand's lying and her actions, she discussed his made-up addiction with the Mormon or LDS church in an effort to disrupt his life. As she had broken confidentiality with her patient, she was reprimanded. But in August 2013, her license was reinstated. Several other male patients have also spoken up and reported similar encounters with Jody Hilderbrand, who initially started treating them for other issues, but inevitably told each and every one of them that they had an adult entertainment addiction and began shaming them for it.
3 men have come forward to say that they went to Jody for family counseling, but were railroaded into porn and sex addiction treatment, even though they did not suffer from those problems.
This video is so hard to lighten up like I usually try to do in videos, because there's so much information and I know it's dense, but also internally I'm just like, nah. It's possibly the sound of my heart growing 3 sizes this day because I don't like this. Something I'd like to briefly mention here, because I do think it matters, is that it seems like Jody's very bizarre and messed up, twisted perception of intimate relations seems to have rubbed off on Ruby. Back in September 2023, during a court appearance, Ruby made some really intense accusations towards her children. Jody Hilderbrand referenced this in a clip that I included earlier, if you guys remember. Ruby claimed that one of her children began looking at adult content at the age of 3. She also said that one of her children did things of an inappropriate nature to their sibling. This child apparently confessed to doing inappropriate things to 20 people, including cousins and neighbors. She then said that the same child teamed up with the sibling they'd touched inappropriately, and the 2 of them began harming other children together. Like a creepy Batman and Robin situation, I guess. Honestly, this is just like, what the fuck? Look, it's entirely possible that this is true and these things actually happened. I mean, it's not the craziest thing in the world. But given what we know about Jody Hilderbrand and her belief system and her ideologies and the way that she goes about putting them out into the world, this kind of feels like this is a Jody thing. And if we go back to what Jody Hilderbrand was saying, it's pretty obvious that this child confessed because the only way to make the pain and the torture stop is to confess. I just really can't imagine what sort of a person you have to be to do this to children, to tiny little pudding humans, and then, you know, put this on them. And they have to live with that for the rest of their lives. Like, I can't even fathom that. I also think that this is Ruby once again fabricating memories, which we'll come back to shortly. But in the interim, the person that I would like to draw attention to now is another family member who was accused by probably Jody and by Ruby of having an addiction to intimate content, to adult content, and that's none other than Ruby's own husband, Kevin, who we haven't actually discussed yet in this video. Kevin and the children were in many Connections videos over the years, but after June, July, he was notably absent. Before this, Kevin had been very active with Connections, even making a very long video discussing how much the program had helped him with some of his personal issues.
Connections, I came to realize that the principles that are taught here in the community that supports one another and holds each other accountable. This isn't a money community. This isn't a sex addiction community. This is a community and a group of individuals who are dedicated and desirous to live their lives in truth.
However, behind the scenes, Ruby and Kevin were in absolute turmoil. At some stage, the Frankie parents had invited Jody Hilderbrand to move into their home while she was experiencing some personal issues. A short time later, Ruby asked Kevin for a, quote, in-home separation, meaning Kevin could still live in the home, but they would not act as a married couple. Kevin said that suddenly there were rules on how he could behave in his own house, such as leaving whenever he wanted, but needing permission from Ruby to come back, not being able to go into the kitchen to eat until Ruby gave permission, and he wasn't even allowed to go upstairs in his own home at all, as this was Jody's space. Kevin described the at-home separation further, saying, "I can't describe to you what torture and hell it was to live an entire It was more than a month, really, in complete isolation, believing that I was like evil and manipulative and lying and selfish, and that I had abandoned my family, and that I was more interested in my selfishness than my family. And when he refers to selfishness, I actually think he's talking about the made-up addiction to adult entertainment that Jody had told him that he had, but we'll get to that in a second. In July of 2022, Kevin and Ruby officially separated. While he says that his wife had asked him to leave the home and he did so complicitly, he also said that this was in part because he was struggling with an adult entertainment addiction that I just mentioned. In the early days of the family's relationship with Jody, she had convinced Kevin to attend her men's group therapy sessions, where men talked about their struggles with different addictions. During his police interview at the time of Ruby's arrest, Kevin said, "There were probably 10 men in the group. It was on Zoom. All of them were working through various stages of sex addiction, adult entertainment addiction, and drug addiction. It was like a 12-step group for general addiction therapy." During this interview, he also made several alarming comments, such as that he hadn't seen his children in a year, that his wife had asked him to leave, and that he still respected Jody Hilderbrand and connections. I think it's important to also note that Kevin told officers that he had no idea anything was happening to his children, which I personally think is a giant cop-out. Now, I am completely speculating here, but I am of the opinion that Jody convinced Kevin that he had an addiction to adult content and to other not great things in order to push him out of the home so that Jody could have greater access to Ruby and her children. And to some, that comment on its own rightly might sound completely insane, but as far as family separation goes, orchestrated by Jody, this has been articulated by Ruby's own sisters. In a video from September 2023, Julie, Ruby Frankie's sister, said that things seemed fine until Ruby, Kevin, and the kids started seeking family counseling through Jody Hilderbrand. Julie says that the wider family felt weird about Jody and her teachings, but didn't articulate these feelings to Ruby.
Seemed to be fine anyway. We were a typical family. She was getting some therapy counseling because their family needed it, which I think is great. However, I think you need to get it from a great source. Read the reviews. Jody Hilderbrand and her website or therapy style, I don't know what you want to call it, connections, was not a great resource. And we all saw it. We all felt weird about this Jody lady. We weren't comfortable with it. We didn't like it. We didn't like the teachings Ruby was bringing to the family functions, and we were this close to telling her, if you come to our family events anymore, we do not want to hear what you were learning through connections because we don't like it. We never did say that to her, but we thought it.
She goes on to say that, out of nowhere, Ruby suddenly cut off her friends and family without a single word, except to her mother, whom she called up and verbally abused.
No, literally nothing. She did call my mom and yelled at my mom on the phone for 45 minutes and accused her of things that were not true. It was almost as if Ruby had been making up memories from her childhood. She was trying to grab at anything she could, and she would exaggerate on everything. So she started all of her lies back then, lying to everyone in her life, getting rid of all of her friends and family.
The comment Julie makes about Ruby fabricating memories is really interesting because her other sister Bonnie articulated this too, saying Ruby accused their parents and her siblings of things none of them remembered happening. Bonnie also blames Jody for the family distress that took place through Ruby.
As things have unfolded now, we can see that this is something that Jody has done, is she gets in people's lives and she plants these ideas or accusations against people when that it's just not true. And so we really came to the conclusion that the things she's saying are untrue. We don't know why she's saying this. We don't know what her end goal is. In the beginning, I just thought, well, she's making things up so that she has something to discuss in therapy.
During sentencing, Ruby's family made it very clear that they believed Jody had brainwashed her. In a written statement to the court, her parents said, "We noticed a shift in Ruby's thinking the summer of 2020, and by that fall, she had cut all ties to us, her siblings, and close friends. For 3 years, what brief communications we had with her, she accused us of either things that never happened or she grossly exaggerated the events that did. She was delusional. She was so deeply brainwashed we could not recognize her." This sentiment was similarly reflected by Ruby's attorney, who also argued that she was indoctrinated by Jody Hilderbrand, saying, "Ruby has unwrapped the layers of deceit and deception forced upon her by Jody." On this point, something that I think is really interesting and 100% worth mentioning is that in the early jail call recordings that were released by the police, Ruby starts off defending Jody. But right before sentencing, it's very clear, based on Ruby's own words, that something in her perception of the situation shifted. And maybe that's due in part to her lawyer repeating back to her her own beliefs in a way that made her realize that they're crazy pants. But also because Ruby learned that Jody was denying having basically any involvement with what happened to the children. Because of course she did!
I think putting the pieces together and just seeing, like, she knew she was lying the whole time. Like, and it's embarrassing too to, like, repeat it. It's like, oh my gosh, how gullible was I? Oh my gosh, how much power I gave this person, and I didn't see it. But when I realized, so she had, her attorney's name is Doug Terry, and mine's Lamar, and Lamar, you know, maybe a month into it, he's maybe not even that long, he's like, Jody denies everything. She denies having anything to do with this. And I was shocked. I was like, what? And I'm still telling Lamar, like, you know, all of the justifications and all of the, you know, I'm talking like a criminal. I sound like a mad person. He was so patient with me. He was so patient with me. He would just look at me and, like, kind of dumbfounded, like I said 2 + 2 is 7, and I really believed it, and he would just stare at me. I'm like, what am I saying that's so off? And but that's because I really believed it. But then when I heard that Jody was not talking like that, she was denying the whole thing, it told me she knew all along, and she's hiding it. And then I was like, crap, what am I on? And that's when things kind of started turning. I was like, she's not been honest. I didn't know she wasn't honest. I didn't know she would lie. And it's like, what else has she been lying about? Where else have I been deceived?
The reality is that with these recordings, you never actually know if what these people are saying is what they truly think and believe. But I think as far as Ruby goes, this is at least just my opinion, I think she really did work out there at the end that she got completely duped. Like, just absolutely head dunked under the water repeatedly, just like, I am the Lord of Stupid Town. I mean, seriously, how could you not? I guess prison really does give people a lot of time to think. The last little thing I want to add here is that there was a third woman involved in all of this. A woman called Pam Bodcher, I don't know how to say this, who is listed as the president of the Connections Foundation on the website. Pam and her husband seemed really taken aback when police rolled up on their property because they had one of the teenage Frankie children in their home, who they said came over and cleaned for them. In the body cam footage that we have access to, Pam says that Ruby is her friend, but didn't seem terribly surprised when police said that she'd been arrested for child abuse. Pam's husband, similarly, was more concerned about his wife being cuffed in the back of a police car than learning about the child abuse as well. So there's that. I really don't know how they fit into all of this, and maybe they don't at all, but I feel like they probably do, and so therefore it's probably worth mentioning, but I don't really know what to make of it, so there you have it. Now, like I said at the start of this video, there is obviously so much information about this case. And there's even more information about Jody and Ruby and their relationship that I haven't included because we'd be here for 15 years. It's also worth mentioning that it's quite hard to get a hold of YouTube videos for both the 8 Passengers and Connections YouTube channels because YouTube terminated both of them. And apparently people who re-upload the content risk being banned. So, you know, there's that too. Ultimately, Ruby Franke and Jody Hilderbrand were a match made in hell as far as this situation goes. And while Ruby already had the makings of an abusive parent, it didn't really take much in the end to push her further down the road of abuse and violence. You know, perhaps the greatest tragedy in all of this is that these pudding people, Ruby's pudding people, are going to have to live with this for the rest of their lives. And the harm to them came from their mother, the one person in this world that they should have been able to trust. So many people around these kids completely failed them, including their father, who basically abandoned them when they needed him most. And ultimately, I find it really quite remarkable that Jody Hilderbrand was able to carry out this level of depravity for as long as she did, even while working for her church and basically, in a way, being protected by her church. But perhaps what makes an already horrific series of events even worse is the fact that in most retellings of these events, Jody's participation is almost treated with indifference, acting as though she was a simple bystander to Ruby Franke's hellish plot rather than a key participant and perhaps even the mastermind behind all of this to begin with, does not do justice to the depravity experienced by the Franke children. In the end, I am certain that there is much more here to uncover. But what we do have paints a picture of a woman who wanted to abuse children and a mother who helped make that a reality. Now, on that really happy and pleasant note, and before I open the floor to all of you, this is just a reminder to check out Lions Tea Exchange, my little company, using the link in the description. We have a bunch of really, really yummy flavors. The Raspberry Elderflower Rosé is definitely the crowd pleaser, so if you're into teas that are very delicious, go and check it out. Go and buy a box. Like I said, it definitely helps support the channel and allows me to make content like this. Now I open the floor to all of you. What do you all think? Are you on my side of the fence and believe that Jody Hilderbrand was probably the mastermind behind all of this and the levels of depravity that we saw? Or are you thinking more so that Ruby actually was just acting of her own volition and Jody was there along for the ride? What do you make of their bizarre relationship and how all of this started to play out? Do you think that Ruby kind of would have ended up here anyway, given that she was already displaying abusive behaviors and this was just the logical next progression of her own behavior? What do you think of Kevin Franke, who I know I didn't really talk about too much, but what do you think of him kind of not participating in protecting his own children? Do you think that he was complicit? Do you think he was not complicit? What do you make of that situation? And what do you generally make of this issue overall? As always, if you have made it this far in the video, congratulations. I always like having you along for the full ride, especially in this case, because this video is what, double how long my ones usually are? If you are not subscribed already and you would like to see more of me and more of this kind of content, feel free to subscribe to the channel, as well as leaving a like on this video and a comment, because I do love reading your comments. I read the majority of them and I always like hearing your insight. Of course, thank you so much for sticking around to the end of the video. I very much look forward to reading your thoughts and feedback on this case, and I will see you pretty people in the next video.